Good evening. Welcome to Rose City Politics. It is July 21st. Our regular panel tonight includes Doug Sartori. Doug, how you doing?
Doing just fine, John. Thanks for asking.
Glad that you're here. We have Pat Papadakis as well. Pat, where are you coming to us from?
Well, my background today is a lovely Greek salad. I heard we're going to be talking about multiculturalism or something, so I thought I would, bring in a little bit of the culture into the discussion, apparently.
There you go. It looks good. I am John Lidke. We have a guest tonight joining the show in the panel, Leslie McCurdy, acting chair of the Black Council of Windsor-Essex. How are you this evening?
I'm wonderful, thank you. And I'm sharing a background here that comes from, it's where Harriet Tubman was injured. And since that's one of the most famous stories, that Black Canadians know of, I thought I would share that as part of our multiculturalism contribution.
It's a place that we can start with it for sure. I want to thank you for joining the show. It was a stressful piece, having to watch along with it, having to follow along with it. So we're going to be diving into that coming up. But first, please do support Rose City Politics by becoming a Patreon subscriber at patreon.com/Rose City Politics. We are on Facebook, Twitter, wherever you get your podcasts. So feel free to like, share, and subscribe, as the kids say. And we broadcast live on tape thanks to the kind support of Leuna 625, building better communities. So I'm going to set the stage here on this story, and then we're going to, I guess, get into a bit of a free flow conversation about it, because I think there's going to be so much that's just going to be discussed that trying to stick to any specific format isn't going to be the best for this evening. But let's set the stage right now. City of Windsor anti-racism initiative is criticized as inadequate. Windsor Star's Dawson Chen put this out. It was a marathon council meeting, went on for a number of hours, 3 hours at least, and a $200,000 anti-racism initiative by the city of Windsor is being criticized as lacking in real action and consultation on race issues. The anti-racism initiative was sparked last year by Black Lives Matter demonstrations after the murder of George Floyd by a police officer in Minnesota. Now, part of the basis for this initiative was a community survey that was launched by Mayor Dilkins and administrative staff, which was meant to focus on anti-Black racism. As a result of that survey, we'll be getting into that a bit later on. There were a lot of questions that were brought up about that survey specifically. Who was responding to it? What was it going to be used for specifically? Now, as I said at the outset, a total of $200,000 in funding will be used for an awareness campaign, training initiatives, internships, mentorships, bursaries, scholarships, development grants, and heritage interpretation and storytelling. I'll put a bit of an editorial focus there. That's a lot of things to accomplish for what's relatively a very small amount of money in a city budget. Now, the Multicultural Council said very clearly, this is just a proposal, their initiative. They wanted to make clear of that, but it was developed in partnership with them. As I said, it was a marathon debate, went on for 3 hours, and it ended up being approved 7-2. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to bring in your voice, Leslie, here on this, because, you had spoke to council and you had, I'm sorry, I just got logged out of my Google Docs here, so I lost access to seeing everything. You had a lot of criticisms about this, about how it played out. So I'd like to just sort of give you the floor right now. How did it play out from your perspective? What was the takeaway from this?
That the city administration, the city leadership, the council and the mayor need to do some real anti-racism work themselves, because many of them didn't seem to know the difference between multiculturalism. They didn't know the difference between religion and race. I should finish multiculturalism and anti-racism between religion and race. They kept calling on the Muslim community, but very many Africans, Black people are Muslim. It's a religious practice, not a race. So that's, again, a cultural thing, a religious thing, and not having to do with racism. I don't know if they necessarily understand the fact that racism is sort of embedded into our culture so deeply that it's difficult for people to recognize it. And it takes a lot more deep training than storytelling and sharing your experiences to, to start to understand that. One of the main issues we had was that we were listed as an organization that had been consulted for this anti-racism initiative. In our reading, we understood that to be specifically for the initiative. They tried to say that, well, we are a group that they talked to at some point, which is tokenism at best. And really, if the intent is to do some real work, then really that $200,000 should be used to really research and do real consultation with members of the community based on the definition of consultation that I provided that's considered a municipal standard, and really do some real work, not just this performative stuff of $200,000, here's an initiative, we're doing some anti-racism stuff. And then on top of that, I mean, you can talk about anti-racism stuff, but specifically the real work that needs to be done is anti-Black racism work. And that wasn't even mentioned at all. In fact, when, is it Kathleen Johnson from the Multicultural Council was even talking about her programming, she didn't mention anti-racism once. Ironically, the Multicultural Center Council is actually evolved from something that was an anti-racism council at one time, that was started back in the time when my parents were working on trying to fight against discrimination and prejudice and stuff in housing and jobs here in Windsor. And the problem is there are still issues today about housing and jobs. I mean, one of the points I made is that, you could send the kids to school, but if the school is dysfunctional and not, teaching people properly, then you're still going to get miseducation. And a young Black child can graduate from a university at the top of their class and still have trouble getting a job because of the structural systemic issues that have to be dealt with. I mean, it's nice that they're giving thought to it, but it would have been much, much better had they done some consultation to really find out the kind of work that really needs to be done. And it's a bit more than providing bursaries and scholarships and storytelling time.
I'd like to pick up on that again. When I first read out that list there for the 200,000, I saw your head start to nod along there, because I don't think people would argue against using that as a starting point, to a certain extent, right? This is an awareness campaign, training initiatives, internships, mentorships, bursary scholarships, development grants, heritage interpretation, storytelling. But for $200,000, it's a drop in the bucket. It's not going to achieve anything. I guess, what type of money are you looking at to actually have had, a meaningful impact? You brought up their referencing of your involvement as, tokenism. Do you see this entire initiative, I guess, through that sort of lens then, as, we can put a check mark and say we did something here? It's not going to achieve the goals, but at the end of the day, there can be a press release, there can be a press conference, and maybe we can campaign on it. I mean, what's an actual outcome?
Well, that's exactly what we think it appears to be. I can't put a dollar figure to anything where real consultation hasn't been done. We have to have the conversations. We have to look into how the issues manifest, particularly in Windsor and Essex. The Black Council of Windsor-Essex has been engaged with a Black urbanist, the same Black female urbanist that the federal government has engaged to make sure that the 25 million infrastructure grant that they put together is shared through an equity lens, to make sure that it's being shared equitably, and not, because often when there's a lot of money, the last people to get money is the Black community. Everybody else gets part of the pool first, which tends to happen with multiculturalism as well, because there are certain groups that tend to be more politically active. And so they get a little bit more attention, but Black Council is going to try and work on that as well. So, I mean, really, the issue is that they didn't have these conversations, and we would like to have these conversations. And based upon these conversations, we can decide what kind of real kind of structural steps can be taken to make changes here in our area.
So then I guess, as you're saying, that consultation is what needs to be the starting point. And then I'll bring in, some of the roundtable voices here after this, but it's been a year of supposed consultation, right? What's your take on that?
Well, I wouldn't call it consultation, as again, a lot of times just having meetings can be performative, and yes, we gave some information about some issues that people are concerned with, but we were not consulted on how we can start to address them and fix them. And let me read. I'm going to read to you exactly what consultation is. That's considered common good practice across municipalities. Okay, it says the process of working collaboratively with and through groups of people affiliated by geographic proximity, special interest, or similar situations to address issues affecting the well-being of those people. It is a powerful vehicle for bringing about environmental and behavioral change that will improve the health of the community and its members. It often involves partnerships and coalitions that help mobilize resources and influence systems, change relationships among partners, and serve as catalysts for changing policies, programs, and practices. None of these things that are in this initiative is going to achieve anything of that. So consultation with the community could have helped to provide some ideas at what kind of work can be done to actually make those deep structural changes within the community.
If I could jump in, I'd like to pick up on the consultation piece because I listened to it last night. I listened to the recording. I had to actually stop on a few occasions and pace and kind of do is this really happening throughout some of those discussions? But I want to pick up on the consultation piece first. I'll have some other things to say from a political lens, given our show on what was happening around that table. And I know that Doug often talks about consultation, so he may have a few things to say on this as well, in how the city does consultations. But I have to pick up from what Leslie said, and I think that they can't even call this a consultation. In fact, when the mayor was referring to it in many instances in a defensive way, he kept referring to conversations. And I want to connect this whole concept with the fact that this connection to MCC, the report, not the funding. He wanted to make that clear. The funding is coming from the capital budget. And just to back up for a moment, that was committed by council, actually very much so as a result of the Black Lives Movement, which is obviously not Windsor specific, but what was happening. And that's at the time that was done. Now we've come back full, sort of a year later. Water down is something that we can say has happened to this whole situation, but this has been a result of some conversations that the mayor had. And again, there was criticism about the report. There were no specifics about that. And even the survey itself, when push came to shove and Chris Menard from the mayor's office had to defend this report, what was very clear is that the conversations happened as a result of what was happening in our environment and the awareness that we recognize what was happening in all places and suddenly come to the realization that as much as we want to say that Windsor is one of the most diverse cities, we trot that out as much as we can. That maybe there was some recognition in the height of this awareness last year that racism is also pervasive in Windsor and that we're not in any way special. And now how do we take this and how do we move on? Fast forward a year later, the survey that was done was actually done at that time. So the survey was not to inform, moving forward. The survey, from what I could gather, was almost to justify whether Windsorites thought we have a racism problem. This is the way that I saw the survey. Because you can't have it both ways. You can't call it a consultation on we've recognized the problem and move on. And in fact, but they tied it all in and pretended that this was all some kind of consultation. Even the mayor himself continue to use the word conversations. Now, I'm going to go on to some criticism here, which may not be shocking. And here's what I have to say. I'm going to have a question for you at the end, Leslie, because I read the report in the paper, and so I'll set it up for you, where the mayor, in fact, mentions you by name in the Windsor Star report and says even Leslie thought this was a good start. Now, I want to know whether you feel that is an accurate interpretation of what you said as a delegate, as a delegation in front of council the other night. And if not, and I'm going to suggest to you, like, I personally feel that here's another one where the mayor actually has categorized this whole thing as an attack on the Multicultural Council. That was not my impression of those asking hard questions that night, that they were attacking the Multicultural Council. The criticism was in how this proposal came to be, how it's been, how it came to City Council, and actually what's in it in relation to, does it address the issues that were at first gave rise to the fact that City Council said we want to set aside some money for this, and whether this program, this proposal actually addresses the very reason that those funds were set aside. So given that the mayor took it upon himself to interpret what Leslie represented that night, given that the mayor has interpreted that this was an attack on Multicultural Council, and given that there are no specifics, call them conversations or consultations, but we know they came out of the mayor's office, how much confidence do we have, and I can answer you for me, that interpretation of those conversations and or consultations that ended up in the report through their own interpretation was in fact what happened?
Well, yeah, I definitely saw how the mayor manipulates words and phrases for his own advantage. First, I'd like to make one point. Black Lives Matter is specific to Windsor. You know, when the Black population is 6% of our population, yet 18% of the people who meet with physical interaction with the police, that's a Black Lives Matter a topic, okay? When the education system is still streaming Black children into lower educational levels, that's still a Black Lives Matter concern. So there are still Black Lives Matter concerns. I did not agree with the mayor that this was a good start. I believe my words were that while we agree with the mayor that there is still a lot to be done, this is at least a start. So it was not a good start at all. We just agreed that, yeah, okay, you guys are starting something. So I didn't appreciate that. The Multicultural Council was not under attack. We constantly praise the Multicultural Council for the work that they do with multiculturalism and settlement issues and things like that. But they do not do anti-racism work as part of those settlement measures. Even though that is part of their mandate, that is not something that they focus on. You can ask a lot of people from the Black community that have had interactions with them or even have worked with them, and they find them completely inadequate when it comes to addressing issues of anti-racism. But what they do, they do well. They don't do anti-racism. They do settlement and language learning and multiculturalism and that kind of thing, and that they do well. I mean, I look forward to Carousel of Nations every year.
So interesting that you mentioned Carousel of Nations, thus my Greek salad. I had to really wince when Joanne Geniak mentioned Carousel of Nations. And, you know, it was all a package. There was a real lack of distinction between anti-racism and multiculturalism. I think Councillor Reno Bordelin, who really took the opposing view at that meeting, tried to hammer that particular issue, and I don't think it got addressed by anybody. And again, I think that the mayor's criticism was actually not directed at you. When he mentioned the attack on Multicultural Council, I got the impression that he was trying to throw that at the councillor who was most vocal about his criticism of this report and this proposal, in my view.
It's the councillor who, in our view, was an ally in trying to articulate concerns that members of the Black community have. So I applaud him for that.
Off the top, one of the questions that Joanne Geniak had is this, and I wrote it down. She said that she directed a question to Kathy Thomas, by the way, is the executive director of the Multicultural Council. And she says, I'm sure we would like to develop one strategy to address these issues and cases and across all cultures, but I know that's not true. I know that there are some cultures, again, even just that we have to use the word cultures instead of addressing what this is. But anyway, she says, I know that's not true. I know that there are some cultures that struggle more than others. So can we expect, she asks of Kathy Thomas, that we will see culturally specific recommendations within the package? So for those that are council watchers, what this is she's recognizing suddenly that there's criticism of the proposal. I'm going to, since the mayor can interpret, Pat Papadeas is going to interpret what she saw too. My interpretation of this question is giving an opportunity to Kathy Thomas at this point to say, to try and rebound from the criticism that we're now talking about all cultures and the similarity between all the adversity and all of that, and trying to basically say that this isn't your full package. Are you going to have some other consultations and actually look at something a little more specific as it may need addressing? And this was the response. It's possible. I don't know. It depends on the discussions with the cultural groups. And this was a running theme throughout the meeting, to the point where um, Councillor Kieran McKenzie also struggled with it. He wanted a friendly amendment. For those that didn't watch it, he wanted a friendly amendment to Joanne Geniak's motion. The motion was to accept this proposal and to grant the $200,000 and proceed with it. He tried for a two-part friendly amendment. One of those was to that the Multicultural Council had to consult with, and I'm going to have to be careful with the language, but I think he himself used, does anybody know what the language used? I think it was cultural groups, but I'm not sure. So don't quote me on that. But the second one, and that was a friendly amendment. And then the second one, a friendly request for friendly amendment, was to talk with the diversity committee, which is a committee, standing committee of council, and she rejected that, which is also interesting. I think at some point we should talk about the fact that there was criticism and a letter from the chair of that committee saying they too were not properly consulted. So she rejected that. So Fabio Constante, Ward 2 city councillor, same thing. His concern was really around the consultation. Now I have to say, I'm going to fast forward to the end. At the end of this motion that succeeded 7-2, this resolution that succeeded, after that, Councillor McKenzie brought his motion. There were 3 councillors, and the motion was to specifically ensure that the Multicultural Council reports back regularly to the Diversity Committee. And in fact, 3 people voted against that. So I think that's worth discussing in a little bit. And that those councillors were Joanne Geniak, help me here, Ed Freeman, which relates to previous conversations we've had about how those votes go, and the mayor. That's a really interesting vote as well, in terms of, here you have a lot of criticism about the nature of consultation, and a follow-up one that ties in the very committee that was designed by council to address this issue. In fact, it's the first part of what their terms of reference are, and 3 people vote about actually putting it, formalizing the fact that Multicultural Council should have conversations, consultations, whatever you want to call it, with the city's own diversity committee, who reports and advises council. Just a fascinating day. I have to say that despite the good questions about consultation from Kieran McKenzie and Fabio Constante, I was actually very disappointed in both of them for the way they ultimately voted. I'm just going to put that out there.
I have-
Okay, oh, go ahead, Leslie. I'll
If I
come in
may,
after
when
you.
it comes to referencing culture, I'm going to tell you a story. When I was a young artist coming out of school, I applied for a grant from the Ontario Arts Council for a dance project. They wrote back to me and said that I should apply for a cultural grant. My question to them is, what culture? I'm 8th generation Canadian. My family has been here since 1842. My culture is Canadian. And that is what a lot of Black and Indigenous Black Canadians who have been here generationally find so insulting, is the constant reference to culture when we are Canadian, and the part of the Canadian culture we have difficulty with is the part that treats us differently because of systemic racism.
So I just,
You want to jump here, Doug? If
yeah,
you don't mind, I just want to add a point to that. And I think what Leslie said at the very beginning as we started is actually the biggest emphasis I would like to see and point out, which is, to me, this demonstrated that council members and council as a whole, if there's any money that should be put for training and education, they should start by looking in the mirror. Because here's the thing, I wrote a lot of this stuff down. The mayor at the end, I think he was mentioning mayor's office reached out to most. I'll come back to that. Let me just stick with this. There was mention of West End at one point, and he actually used the words people on the West End of a different color. Now, look, we can all say we've not always been perfect in our language, and there are times that we all continue to learn. But the fact that you're sitting there and you are it, and everything else that's not yours is the different color. I'm tying this to, if you don't mind, Leslie, the sort of the perspective that just the language alone tells us how how one may see things. Why is that a different color?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
so I just wanted to pick up on the consultation stuff. Pat, I think you had a lot of good points here, but from my perspective, I think it's important to think about where this initiative sits and why. And that may be illuminating in terms of the consultation and how it's gone. Why do issues sit in the mayor's office? And there are two reasons that I can see. One reason is that the mayor wants to control it, to take credit for it. And the other reason, which is the reason that I think applies here, is because the mayor wants to control it because he sees it as an issues management problem. I'm not confident, and nothing that has happened throughout this last 12 months since the protests in Windsor gives me a reason to think that Mayor Dilkens sees this issue as something that should be grappled with by himself or the city. Rather, he sees it as, and I'm just going to assign some cynical motives here, he sees it as an issue that represents some risk that needs to be managed until it goes away. And I think that that is the tenor of the consultations and explains why they went the way they did. There were no, to my knowledge, there were no open public conversations that happened as part of this consultation. There was no opportunity for members of the Black community to have an open forum with elected officials that was public, to which anyone could attend, to talk about the issues in Windsor. And I think there's a reason for that. I think there's a reason why these conversations happen behind closed doors. And Leslie, one of the things that happened in your delegation was there was a bit of a back and forth about the nature of the communication between yourself and the group that you represent and the mayor's office, in that they wanted to make sure that they were going to control the structure and the leadership of any body that came out of this to address it. This is all about managing the issue. This is not about solving the problem. And I think when you look at the outcome that we got, and I know we'll talk about the MCC and the why the Multicultural Council was sole sourced on this, and I think it's an important conversation, and I hope we explore that fully later. But the Multicultural Council is I think perceived, and based on the based on what transpired at council and the comments from councillors, I think that they're perceived as a safe place to park this issue. And I think for Mayor Dilkens, that is essential. What he doesn't want is for this issue to turn into a political liability. And I just want to, before, I want to let others speak, but before I leave it, I think it's really interesting to think about what happens in this town when different people get angry. There is no question that anger and frustration was part of the reason why those protests happened last year and why there has been continued and sustained pressure. Let's think about some other instances, and I don't mean to trivialize this at all, but think about other instances where members of the public get angry. And I'm going to mention a topic that I've come back to time and time again, and that is the damn streetlights in Southwood Lakes. People got angry about the streetlights in Southwood Lakes. People got angry. They expressed themselves in public. They expressed themselves presumably privately to the mayor and members of council. They expressed themselves in letters to the editor, and that issue was taken seriously. The anger of those constituents was taken seriously. What about anything that has transpired in terms of anti-Black racism and this initiative makes you think that or would lead one to think reasonably that that this issue is being taken seriously and that people's anger matters?
I can't think of much.
I-
Let me just say, I will say that because there were a couple of council members, Chris Holt, Reno, I think Kieran, that mentioned that this initiative started specifically as an anti-Black racism initiative originally, and it's been watered down. So the fact that there are some people who are thinking about that leaves a shred of encouragement that eventually something will happen, not necessarily under this administration. So, looking ahead to the future and the possibility of other administrations and possibly working to try and ensure that there is a different administration is something that we are looking at this time as a council.
It's interesting because I watched at the end how Mayor Dilkens addressed the issue. The question was, why was this led out of the mayor's office? First of all, it was in the capital budget. That's the city's budget. That's the city administration takes care of that budget. And the only correction that the only thing he wanted to point out, which is misleading if you're not fully understanding this, that the money is not coming from the mayor's office. Absolutely, we know the money's coming from the city administration's budget. So why wasn't it the city administration that led how that money was going to be spent? The city administration, which presumably has more robust tools and is much more practiced at least a consultation process and understanding that type of process, and maybe it would have led to how we don't sole source perhaps who's going to take care of it, who's going to steward, and what kind of program should come from that. But his response to why it was led from the mayor's office was, well, because it was the mayor who consulted and had conversations with these 16 groups. So what? As mayor, you could be talking anyway, but that is very different than suddenly who appointed you as somehow the commissar of single-handedly championing the issue just because people have conversations with you. It still doesn't make sense. It is not an adequate explanation why. And then we had the result that the report was written out of his office. And here's the other thing, and correct me if I'm wrong for those that watched it as well, but this is what I got. At the beginning, um, and throughout the meeting, it was questioned why this proposal and this recommendation was to give the money to the Multicultural Council to execute the proposal, which had flexibility apparently as time went on throughout the questioning, that things could change and we can assign different things. So really, at the end, even the response from Multicultural Council, and I know I'm being more critical than anybody was critical that night, and I'm okay with that, by the way. Again, I'm going to stress that I am a big fan of the Multicultural Council, and if we're going to talk about Carousel Nation and positive things, telling our positive stories of diversity, all for it. Do I think that they are in any way equipped to understand the issue that brought the very fact that $200,000 was allotted, and to develop the program and advocate for the things that need to be done? Absolutely not. And that is not a criticism of Multicultural Council. That's a criticism of the administration, who dare to even bring this recommendation forward and put them in the position, whether they volunteer to do so themselves or not, in order to access that funding. And so here we have, the situation where throughout the questioning, they were told that Multicultural Council became aware that council wanted to do something, and that's their space, the way they see it. And so came to the mayor's office with a proposal, with the idea of doing a proposal. What's also interesting is at one point, somebody from administration came in to answer the question why it wasn't sole sourced. And if anybody remembers the answer to that, it's because there are exceptions to sole sourcing this kind of thing if it falls under education and training, which I'm going to cynically suggest to you that education and training is in the proposal for the very reason of giving the technical out on why this didn't go out for tender. So I'm going to ask you this question. Is the Multicultural Council, and nobody has to answer that, it could be rhetorical, and you can tell from my voice what I think. But in essence, I want to connect to what Leslie said. Black Lives Matters movement ostensibly started as a result of the George Floyd murder, the tragedy, the incident. And that was about police brutality. That was about how police deal. Okay. Now, if we go all the way full circle to that, does anybody have any? And by the way, it just so happens that the mayor also happens to be chair of the police board. If we are really going to take a look at how this started and the issues that persist, and none of those have been solved, and none of them will be addressed through this proposal, do we have confidence that Multicultural Council, with our kumbaya and our, cultural food, and we're going to give out some bursaries, are they going to do the tough stuff when it comes time to it? When we really have to take a look at some of the issues that are ingrained systemically along our institutions within the city?
I do think, though, that there was a little bit of money from the mall, because they had a very specific breakdown in the paper when they announced it over the weekend. So to hear that it's really flexible now, that's, I think that's a little bit of backtracking, because they had very, very specific allocations. And I believe that there was a small pool, maybe $5,000 or something like that, that was supposed to go towards community policing, mentoring unity or something kind of thing. And even, I've been having discussions with somebody just on the side of my own about policing in the schools, because Black children feel very intimidated by police in schools. So even that's an issue of why are police in schools? I mean, are we assuming that our children, Black, who are, whatever their background, their race or their culture, religion, or are we assuming that they're inherently criminal? And so we have to have police overseeing them? Then, and that's something that Black people would ask about, that's just like is for all children. That should be a question. Like, why are we treating our young children like they're about to commit acts of criminality? So and those are the kind of conversations we need to have. And then, for instance, it's been whispered that the mayor doesn't think that the Black community is ready to do things. And I'm like, well, how much real exchange have you had with the Black community? I guess we weren't ready because we didn't want to acquiesce to his, what we would say, colonialist notion that he should be in charge of everything when we are doing anti-racist work, which is specifically about empowering the Black community within a series of systems that disempower us. So, and it, despite what Mr. Menard says, the conversation did stop because we questioned that. And although we had a list of people that we were going to nominate for the council, that was never asked for and thus never shared with their office. So, I was mad because I really don't like when someone lies on me. I was jumping up and down here. They couldn't see me and they couldn't hear me, but no, I didn't appreciate that at all. Because it's like I have receipts. I have the correspondence that went between us, and I have other people that were in those meetings. So, I mean, that was not just disingenuous, that was outright false.
There are just so many places where you can pause as a result of that meeting and really, really just hone in. Like this council meeting could be used, just to like exemplify how sometimes we don't get it. I certainly I'm on my own learning journey, but it's interesting. I'm sort of going back to something you said, Leslie, and that was your experience in applying for that grant. And that was actually something that was discussed by Kathy Thomas again about what some of the things that this proposal is going to do. And it was specifically addressing this idea that there's going to be, part of their program, grants and bursaries. And I was really impressed about the fact that there was going to be like a pledge of anti-racism, because like I think that pretty well will take care of things. But you know, and so the issue is access to these things, and that's how she framed it. And again, I don't want to pick on anybody in particular, but the idea that what was recognized is that, and I'm pretty sure that the words used were, marginalized members of our community have a difficult time accessing services and grants. And so again, if that's true, okay, it's not like there aren't any. It's that they're having is that there's difficulty in accessing. So assuming that that is the proposition, and if there is, that means that's where the systemic problem is. So why don't you fix? Why don't you address why that is and how that is, instead of, right now we're going to create special grants? Like, it's not that there's anything wrong with scholarships and bursaries and grants, and those are great things, but they don't address the very underlying issues that I think a lot of members of the community that were a lot more hopeful to what was going to happen, I think people are a lot further along in the journey of understanding we have issues. How do we start to address them? It almost to me felt like several steps back. In fact, the first step, we're going to have dialogue. What more dialogue can we have? Like, I mean, there's nothing wrong with dialogue and conversations and all of that, but I thought that happened in the height of last year, which led to the fact that there was $200,000 put aside, because we kind of got to the point where we recognized there was a problem. And the next question is, how are we going to start to address it? But when we start saying, well, we're going to start the dialogue, maybe it's just semantics and maybe it's just words and maybe they're pleasant and, things like leveraging and whatever. But I did not have confidence that that there was a true understanding of the problem. And I guess that's really what I'm mostly disappointed in.
Yeah, not a true understanding. And may I also say that last summer, when the mayor was having those Juneteenth conversations and when the survey was being done and all that, the Black Council of Windsor-Essex was not yet in existence. We formed as a result of last summer, and our first meeting would have been August 26th, well beyond the date of most of those things that the mayor was listing as having been consultative.
It's also emblematic of how consultation is done in this city. I harp on this, I feel like every episode now to a certain extent, but as I said, it's that little tick box to say we did what we did and it's enough. We can move on to something else. I think, Doug, your framing about how it was issues management is a really good lens to look at it through. And, I'll question whether or not it is actually a priority of this administration, for the reasons this obviously not. It's the conflation between multiculturalism and anti-racism. It's clearly set up as a smoke and mirrors to not have to actually address it. A $4,000 bursary, is that going to solve racism? I don't think so. I mean, obviously the answer is no. I'm being facetious, but you know what the mayor was really good at was the vaccine stunt that went on for 8 weeks straight. And he was pounding on the table and he was getting attention for it. And he showed that it was a damn priority to him. And I don't see how after a full year of this, you can even begin to say with a straight face that it's a priority. If the majority of the consultations, in quotes, were done a full year ago, if we're at a point right now where the money is going to be put out in a way that isn't going to address what it's even supposed to address, and I guess you could question if what they're even trying to address, it's more insult, and it's not.
Yeah.
No, it's not going to fix a problem, and I think it's going to create more problems.
For sure,
Yeah.
I think the question is, what are they trying to address, John? And I think that's why when you take a look at it from the lens that Doug set up, it makes a lot more sense. But to me, and one of the questions you asked of Leslie was, 200,000. I don't think it's the issue of the money. The issue of the money was debated back when they put it into the capital budget, and so we can revisit. But in fact, I like to start from the starting point of assuming you have $200,000 because that's what was allocated. So it's not because I think that's a diversion. And what was really clear, and both sides, every side of wherever they landed, city councilors, the mayor, the Kathy Thomas, everybody said, $200,000 is not going to solve the the racism problem in our community. And so let's just take that for a given. But to me, it's like a cop out to say, okay, so here's some fluff that we're going to just add to it. You got to start somewhere to address that actual issue. So if you've been given $200,000, is this the best use of that money? It's not the question of could there be more. There's never going to be enough. And let's just assume everybody was right, but they were using that argument. We're not going to solve the problem with this money. But that doesn't say you can throw it away either. And sorry, like as much as I felt that Councillor Bordelin was right on, I thought at times, because I am a fan of his and I know that he's passionate. When he called the report garbage, I think he went a little too far for somebody who's in elected office. Passions run high, but I think some people think I never criticize him, so there, shouldn't have used that word. It may have been garbage, but we could use that language on a podcast. Probably not best to use that language around a council table. I have to tell you one other thing, and I just keep going on all over the place. I do want to come back to this whole idea that there was actual confusion. Did Multicultural Council go to the mayor's office? Because at the end, the mayor said, when he was saying, well, the mayor has led this, mayor's office has led this because it was the mayor that went out and talked to all these people. It was the mayor that consulted with 16 groups. It was the mayor's office that went to MCC. He says that at the end. So that's a contradiction to what was said earlier. So you know what this reminds me of? I'm just going to say it right here. We Charity. Everybody remember We Charity with our federal government and the criticism with, the sole sourcing of the only charity that could have brought forward that project? I know we're not talking that amount of money, but it's exactly, to me, the same example. They went out, they said, this is the only group that can deliver it because we're still working through it. And because we have confidence and because they're local and they gave all the reasons and they came to us, oh, actually we went to them. Well, whatever, let's not do that. And oh, we don't have to sole source for these reasons. It's the same thing. So look, for people that are like critical of different levels, take a look at yourself and see whether you're willing to be critical of this very exact thing, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think the sole sourcing is really interesting. Before I get to that, though, I just want to address that piece about how many times, how many different people around the table said this money isn't going to solve the problem. Well, first of all, you're the body who approved that amount of money and set the amount of money. And I don't understand why at the outset, when you're embarking on something that you hope will make a difference, you're managing expectations down and saying this isn't going to solve the problem. I thought that was very curious and very interesting. But on the MCC thing, you know, sole sourcing and weird, odd choices around sole sourcing are starting to become a pattern that we're seeing here in the mayor's office and the city of Windsor more broadly. The Windsor Works report was also sole sourced, $400,000 plus to consultants. Although, you know, in some cases we like consultants, in other cases we hate them and we hate the profit motive and all that stuff. $400,000 sole source to consultants, and I would suggest consultants handpicked by the mayor's office for whatever reason, political reasons, or you know, hoping to get the kind of result that they wanted. And I think this is the same type of thing. And I think your cynicism and your pointing out of the contradiction is reasonable and well done, Pat. Why would you sole source this? Why would you not even find out and look at the landscape and ask for options? You know, we're spending $200,000 on something that is a big enough problem and has been identified as a big enough problem that special money was carved out for it in the budget, that the mayor, you know, quote unquote, consulted widely, spent a lot of time on it, you know, there's been considerable resources put to this. How are we so convinced that the Multicultural Council is the perfect organization to deliver this, and that there is no reason to even investigate what other organizations might have to say? You know, one of the reasons you put things out to tender is to crowdsource ideas from people who might be interested in the work. You know, proposals often contain interesting elements, even if you don't end up using that particular vendor. Why would you not go through the exercise just to have the enriching conversations with potential vendors and just to have a bunch of different reports that you could look at that might provide some illuminating things? And I come back to what I talked about earlier. This is about issues management. The MCC is a trusted partner who can be relied on not to embarrass the mayor on the issue of racism, which is 100% the wrong reason to grant a contract and 100% the wrong attitude to be bringing to something like this. All the standard disclaimers, yes, I've eaten lots of food at Carousel, blah, blah, blah. I don't think there's any reason to be convinced that they were the best people for the job, and that is a real disappointment. I'm quite disappointed with a number of people around the table, around the council table, who you know, clothe themselves in fiscal responsibility, clothe themselves in prudence. They want to be seen as prudent and careful stewards of public money. And I'm not just talking about the phony fiscal hawks, Fred Francis and Joanne Gignac. I'm talking about people around the table like Gary Kashak. I'm talking about people around the table like Jim Morrison. I'm talking about people around the table like Kieran McKenzie. Folks, this is not a good use of public money, and you voted for it. You have some explaining to do.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, I think about again, this is not to be negative about the Multicultural Council, but I think that they were so wrapped up. Wasn't this actually like on the consent agenda even originally?
Yeah, I think it was originally on consent.
Yeah, I think it might have been. But I mean, again, I just visualize that here's the mayor who already we know, you know, what he hears and how he interprets that and how he translates that. Already, you know, have some issues with that, sort of left in these hands. One of the mayor's staff members to put together this report, work with one of those trusted partners, as you said, Doug, that's not going to make any waves, not to embarrass, not to get too God, you know, who don't want to get to activists or whatever might happen, and then to ensure that it's developed in a way that it can be sole sourced through technicalities. Here's a question, and then not to identify whether it was in the survey during real time, as Chris Menard said it, or later identify who the groups were, etc. And I'm gonna ask for some leeway here for a moment, and I know you know Leslie, like the point about where we came from in terms of anti-Black racism and where we moved, but the responses and the characterization of multiculturalism as the sort of the banner brand of the Multicultural Council. It's in their name. The idea that the author of the report talked about, well, we don't want to focus on the negatives, we want to focus on the positives, because apparently that's been working for the last 50 years in existence. But here's a question I have about, and I know there was an attempt to talk about all cultural groups, but I want to specifically just for a moment mention Indigenous peoples in our community. All right. So, at what point, how often was that mentioned? Did those words leave the lips of anyone who was presenting this report, frankly? And when we take a look at the cultural groups that the Multicultural Council works with, um, and and again, this is not to take away from the work that they normally do that is good, all right? But at the same time, show me the record that Multicultural Council has with Indigenous groups. I'm just, throwing it out there. So I think that there were some hard questions to ask because there is a focus there. There is a particular focus there, and if you're going to go with that particular focus, um, personally, there are other actual groups in the community. The New Canadian Centre is also a group that is in the same space as Multicultural Council. And if I'm on the board or if I'm there, I'm like wondering, wait a minute, wait a minute. So there are aspects of what Multicultural Council does in the history of what they've done that they do well, and there are parts of things that they have not touched, and there are actually community groups, and I'll use their language, cultural groups, etc., that they don't actually have a relationship and a network with. And so when it's left to, oh, we're going to continue consultations, and when there is pushback of ensuring and just, language that appeases, we are going to consult, but then when push comes to shove, but we don't want anybody reviewing it from the diversity committee, the whole thing just sort of crumbles. And again, I I'm always flabbergasted when stuff goes on at council, and it's like, do you believe this? But this one was a real doozy on, do you believe this?
Actually, it wasn't. It's
Mhm.
kind of what you expect, from my perspective, because that's a lot of people have difficulty with the concept of dealing with their racism because everyone thinks of a racist as somebody who's bad, who's evil, who hates Black people, who, calls them bad names and things. But really, that's not the case. There are very, very good people, wonderful people, people that I love that are racist because our culture is racist. And in its beginnings, it was racist. Canadian culture is built upon a culture that thought it was okay to commit genocide, the people that were here, and to steal people from another continent and bring them here and brutally force them into exploited labor groups, so that is our culture. And ultimately, I mean, if you look even recently, it was a culture that was still killing off one group of people and still by various means keeping another group of people as an underclass so that they could be used primarily as labor. I mean, even today, that is how our culture operates. It's not quite as blatant as the genocide that was committed before and the slave enslavement of people. But I mean, our economics, our cultural institutions and things still provide for those outcomes way too often. And that's what has to be dealt with. Telling stories, few bursaries to schools, not going to get it until people really start to understand what the root and the nature of our racism is. And Black people that are raised here learn it too. I mean, it's not necessarily a black white thing. It is a cultural thing. There are Black people who are racist towards Black people because they've learned it as well, you know, and then it becomes a self-hate and a self-fulfilling type of loathing, you know. So I mean, there are a lot of aspects to the cultural conditioning that we all get in this country, and that's what has to be dealt with.
I
For sure, and
support,
that whole intersectionalism often that we talk about as well in terms of the big picture.
Yeah.
You know, but I want to go back to this point, which was mentioned by Morrison and Councillor Morrison, repeated by the mayor and et cetera, where they kept coming back to, yes, it's not going to solve it, but it's a starting point. But that's the thing. I think it's not a starting point. It is not a starting point. It is a diversion. And in fact, because it's not a starting point, that's what's most disappointing. Nobody, I think, well, I don't know about nobody, but I think that, you know, doing a little, but being bold about it and being really authentic about recognizing and even in with public opinion, all of that, just sort of taking some bold steps of how this might have been a first step, even with a little bit of money towards it, would have been better by now trying to you know, who are we kidding that this is a first step to anything. And as far as the mayor's comments going, well, at least we're keeping it local and we're not going to some Toronto firm to charge us 400,000 for a consultation report, which is laughable because, you know, again, you know, you mentioned Doug Sartori, you know, how much was that? And were they like actually like local? Those weren't local, but didn't matter then. Because they said for that report, we're going to the specialists, right? We're going to the people who understand that. And there are people who understand these issues much more so than the mayor and his office clearly did. And with all due respect, much more so than the Multicultural Council. But here's where we're at.
yeah, I just want to connect Leslie's comments to yours, Pat. And I support the definition of systemic racism that you're talking about, Leslie, and to Pat's point, there are starting points in this community that would cost nothing. There are ways to advance this conversation that would cost nothing. Mayor Dilkins publicly grappling with the notion of systemic racism in our society would do a lot to advance public understanding of the issue. You know, taking a political risk and having a conversation, and you know, an open conversation, acknowledging some of those realities would move the ball forward a hell of a lot more than the way that that this money is going to be deployed. It doesn't have to cost money to make meaningful change or to do something from the heart, but I think that you can look at that survey and those survey responses, and you can start to think about some of the reasons why a less politically courageous approach and stalling tactics and diversionary tactics might be preferable to someone who wants to win a popularity contest. When you look at the number of people who went out of their way to respond to that survey to dismiss the notion that racism exists in Canadian society, that the number of people who went out of their way to label Black Lives Matter a terrorist organization in the responses to that survey, I think that it was really, really telling that that survey was the first step and in this journey that's gotten us here.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask you, Leslie, moving forward, you know, we've focused a lot on everything that is wrong with what this approach has looked like and how we got to here. And you had said a bit earlier, you know, that it won't be for a lack of, you know, continuing to rustle feathers, to put words in your mouth, if you will. What can we expect that the Black Council of Windsor-Essex will be doing to ensure that, you know, this stays a relevant conversation topic at the forefront? I mean, it'd be too easy, of course, to allow for for lack of a better term, to allow for this to be a win that can be trotted out come an election campaign?
Well, first thing we did was compose an editorial that we've sent to the paper, but we have been working with Jay Pitter, who is also affiliated with the Center for Cities at the University of Windsor. And she came to town and did an audit for us. And we will be working with her to take some strategic actions over the next, she's committed to working with us for a year. So all I can say really is stay tuned.
That's terrific news. Many of us were fortunate enough to, this is back when we were in complete lockdown, join her in that conversation. And if I may say, this is where I think they really missed the boat, because they don't sorry, I'm going to go back to city council for a minute and to the mayor's office specifically, because although, I can't blame city administration for this, really wasn't their thing. But I think that city administration, at least the professionalism and the skill set there, would know what a proper first step would be, and that word would be the audit, whether they were capable of it or whether they recognized, hopefully, that they actually, and more likely than not, needed the actual expertise, and that's where you would have started. And that's not what was done. So that's a glaring, to me, process omission. And so I'm really actually glad that I heard audit from you, Leslie, and more specifically. So essentially, you're basically saying that the work is going to continue and get picked up, I think, right?
Yes.
Because it's going to be done by other groups where the city is not doing it.
There are collaborations that are developing that will be trying to exert pressure on the cities.
Well,
It'll be interesting to see the whole sort of, several processes happening in the city by different groups at the same time, and take a look at the one we're going to be celebrating with Greek salads. I know that I get really nasty by the end of the podcast, and people have mentioned this. I get nastier as I go on. So this is my nasty note for the my wrap up of having to witness that a few days last night, and we'll listen to it all. And that is frankly the fact that Joanne Geniac was the mover of this resolution says everything I need to know about how good it was.
And she seemed really upset that we were questioning it at all.
Some people in leadership don't like that pushback, starts to question their motives, right?
Yeah, then why are you a leader? I mean, because the way to be a leader is to, listen to people and lead them, but not to stand ahead of them and, ignore them. So I don't understand that.
Or talk down to people and tell them what we need to do for you.
Yeah.
Like really, there was no listening, and that, again, that's the thing, and that's why it comes full circle with consultation. I know that the guys want to wrap up, but God, I don't know.
I just keep looking at the Greek salad there, and I'm starving.
Okay.
Doug and I are
right.
having a private conversation about it ourselves.
Let's
It's
celebrate
tempting.
multiculturalism in the meantime, I suppose, and let some, I think the wrap up is we have to listen really and really talk about it. And I guess we have to talk about it because we're starting the good start in getting the dialogue going. And here we are.
Maybe
But
intended.
hey, this is what we do. It's a podcast. We get the dialogue going too. So I guess that's a good thing, right?
Yeah.
It's an infuriating topic. That's all I can say, leaving it there.
Yeah.
Leslie, thanks so much for coming on and sharing your perspective on it, educating us on, it, and just keep going, keep us in the loop, because we're going to want to hear about the audit. We're going to want to hear about the next steps that you keep taking, and do our best to help to, continue to spread some actual truths of the matter, rather than, as some counselors have called a BS propaganda campaign.
I thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you. And yes, as we go along, I'd love to continue to engage in conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank
very
you,
much.
Leslie, and I'm really glad that you were at council. I'm really glad
Yeah.
you were at council the other night.
Thank you. I am
So
now
thank
too.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome. Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night. And thank you for listening to Rose City Politics. It is July 21st. Our regular panel tonight included myself, John Lidke, Doug Sartori, and Pat Papadeus. We were fortunate to be joined with our guest tonight, Leslie McCurdy, the acting chair of the Black Council of Windsor-Essex. We talked about the City of Windsor anti-racism initiative, and you go back to the beginning of the podcast and just listen through again. There's a lot that you might want to take away a second time, but if you don't, we understand that as well. But please do consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/Rose City Politics. We are on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. And we broadcast live on tape thanks to the kind support of Leuna 625, Building Better Communities. We will be back next week.